you now to Chris. So it's a great honor for me to have him here actually with us. I know Chris since about, I was calculating Chris, it's about 15 years. It doesn't make us younger. When I was leading foresight at the World Economic Forum, and Chris had founded within Arup, which is a multinational professional services firm for the built environment. He had built there a capability of foresight, innovation, and incubation of kind of new ideas. And that's how we got to know each other. I've always valued tremendously my conversations and my collaborations with Chris. Is very stimulating as a person to talk to. So now Chris recently moved to Zurich, where I used to come from. I was in Geneva. And he is now the Director of Strategic Foresight at ETH Zurich, where he's a strategic advisor to the President and the Executive Board. Also, ETH is an academic institution where Chris, long time ago, used to be a student. So last year, Chris and I, we were both in Singapore as speakers on the Foresight Conference for the Singaporean government. And Chris presented there the scenarios exploring sustainable futures to 2050. It was a very well received and very interesting piece of work. And so we thought it would be a great moment now to bring this actually to the government of Canada. Given Canada's climate change agenda, given many of the conversations talking about COVID-19 maybe being kind of a rehearsal for the many disasters that might occur if we do not start to more properly think about sustainability of our world, I thought this was just an excellent moment to have Chris in such a conversation. So Chris, thank you very much for taking the time with us today.
Pleasure.
And I will give you the floor.
Well, first of all, Crystal, thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Absolutely. And as you have learned from me, I have learned from you as well. And it's been great over the years. So first of all, it is a great pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today. And I am going to do the following. I'm going to be showing a presentation, and then I'll be very open for questions at the end. And I know, I think Claire, you were saying that they could send in questions either in the chat box. Is that where they do it? Or they send it in the Q&A? Or how do they send questions in?
So for the Q&A, I'll collect questions. If you can put them in the chat, and then I'll call on you to ask them, and we'll unmute you. And then if we run out of time, I'll do kind of a summary of a few questions that clearly are coming up from multiple people.
Great, that's super. So I'm very happy to entertain those in the end. So I'm gonna go ahead and blend in the slides now. So I'm gonna share my screen. So you need to give just a moment for this is the Zoom moment, which we all dread when we hope everything works. And then we see, there it goes. Okay. This is an image which I took out of the side of an airplane. And for 3 months, none of us saw this. And it's quite interesting to me because for a long time, I was actually quite obsessed with contrails. They really annoyed me, frankly, because every one of those is water vapor that Mother Nature didn't really intend to be there. They create shadows which have reduced the production capacity of our planet by between 4 and 7%. And at the same time that those have disappeared, we have also been able to notice other things. As Crystal said, for the past 20 years, I was working with Arup, and part of that job was to fly around the world, meeting offices, our staff, our clients, looking down at our planet to see what we have done to our Earth so that we, you and I, can not just survive, but to thrive, to create the housing, to create the food, be it livestock or grain, that we need in order literally to survive and to thrive. And what's really interesting to me is no matter where we go, we also see lots of, I would suggest, unintended consequences. just like those contrails were unintended consequences of the jet exhaust. And these massive carpets of concrete and asphalt covering over productive land are unintended consequences of our need, our desire to have homes, schools, economies, right? So the big question for me as a foresighter is, if we look at all of this, what is our path forward? We can look back and try to project a way forward and imagine a straight line projection, which lots of economists might want to do, or scientists, but I would suggest that that's not necessarily going, our future is not necessarily going to be what we've seen in our past. For many, it will seem to be a winding road, just like that wonderful song. It's a long and winding road. Kind of scary on those curves, and you've got to be careful how fast you go, because you can do it if you don't go over too fast. And man, you need to have the right vehicle or a skateboard or something to make sure you're going up or down. And for many others, the path forward is a blue sky, just as here in the Pacific West. You don't really know exactly which path to take. And actually, it doesn't really matter which path, because you know where your destination is. You're going over there to those hot springs, and how you get there is actually then irrelevant. What's interesting for me, when we're looking at the future, we have a little bit of all of that at the same time. And as a foresighter, the challenge is, how do we deal with this increasing uncertainty? We feel this every day. All of us do, all of us have. And for many, this is a source of fear. For others, it's a source of inspiration. For many, it's paralyzing. For others, it's just energizing. And it's quite fascinating to see how one reacts to the future and the thoughts about what is to come. And so when I look at this and the way I think about this, there is something that is really critical, is how do we envision where we want and need to go? And to me, those are two different things, where we want to go and where we need to go. Very often they're looked at as being the same thing, but they simply are not. Now, when we're doing this, when we're trying to look forward, we can do this with lots of data. I've got hundreds of graphs about where things are going, about how things are changing. You know, it's very scientific. On the other hand, we also need emotion, storytelling, the belief. There are things that each one of us believe that are completely and totally irrational. And yet, you can argue, no, I have everything perfectly rational. I bet we could find something which is an irrational belief. But it's okay, because this is what's beautiful about us as humans, because we have this data and emotional capacity. This science and belief, when they come together, they can help us find a path, find a way. And this to me is really critical, because when we look in foresight, there's this, what we call the cone of the possible. When we look forward, the variability just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger with time as we go out. But then we actually do know there's this probable part, this middle of that bullseye. This is the business as usual case. If things kind of keep going like we expect them to go, this is what we're going to get. But then there is this, which is our preferable future. And this is where policy can come in, where we can begin to set different rules of a game, or where design paradigms can come in. So you can change the way we build or think about a building or a city, or perhaps our lives, where we think our preferable future is this, and how do we start working towards that? And that's very interesting for me, and why at Arup we created these 2050 scenarios. Now, these set of scenarios was the second time I had done a set of scenarios. The first one, big ones, and this is the first one in 2008, 2009. And these, again, I realized, or I thought about 2 years ago, that the world was looking to be in such a tough place that I needed to find a way that we could help envision what a positive future was going to look like. Because it's easy to imagine the negatives. It's got much harder to try to imagine where we're going to land in a positive way. And so we looked at two axes. It's a classic scenario exercise. We did a whole thing with what are the critical factors, and it actually comes down to, well, what's the human condition, the health of our society? Is it increasing or is it decreasing? And upon what do we depend as people? We depend upon our planet, the health of our ecosystems, the health of our oceans, the health of our air, the health of our ecosystems to support us, for us to be a part of. So we took those two axes as our critical axes, if you will, as the most fundamental critical axes to look at the human condition and the planetary health on the planet as a whole. So we came up with 4 worlds. And I'm going to give you the names very quickly, then I'm going to go through them in a little more detail afterwards. The first, where the human condition is increasing, but the planetary is decreasing, planetary health decreasing, we call Humans Inc. This is kind of like the business as usual case where we are right now. The double negative is Extinction Express. That's the spiral downwards. You can see some parts of the world were already in that. And then we've got Greentocracy. It's where society is then living in service of the planet, of the restoration of the planet. So we lose some of our freedoms, lose some of our self-centeredness so that our planet is doing better. And then of course, the double positive, which we really all hope, all hope for, is post-Anthropocene, where the humans are doing great and people are doing great. And so then it's sort of a happiness forever. So this is the graphic, which is in the report, which one can take a look at. So to dig into those just a little tiny bit deeper. Humans Inc. When we're doing the scenarios, I believe it's very important that we engage all of the different learning styles. So there's those who learn by text, learn by image, learn by saying, learn by visual engagement. So we need to make sure whatever we're doing is engaging all of those in a meaningful way. And so here we can get an idea of what that might look like. We also created a graphic, so there's a similar graphical style for all of them, so that one could imagine what our city might look like in business as usual. And here you get to see already, which is kind of surprising, not for smog, but for smog and not for viruses, our little face masks, which have become part of our image. But in Humans Inc., some of the big markers, if you will, that cities are adapting to flooding and other, so we have learned how to adapt. As we're doing now, flood walls are going up. We're dealing, all these, we've adapted. Life expectancy is increasing. Education is on the rise. And yet, water scarcity is increasing. We're extracting more from our aquifers because we're worried about us, not worried about the ecosystem. And we have a much stronger welfare system, upgraded housing, and even the introduction potentially of a UBI, universal basic income. We also try to show some figures. We really looked at what could our population be? What is the wealth gap? We tried to actually, we went through about a 2-year exercise, looking in detail at all of these different factors and what they could be, and use what's called the morphological method to really, in a very rigorous way, try to pull these together. I'm not gonna go into all those. So here we've got some of these right there. And then we created a timeline. We said, what could the story be if that world came to pass? And I know this sort of looks like the Yellow Submarine from the Beatles, but it wasn't intended to be so. But here we made up some opportunity moments, if you will, during which, this is kind of the fun part, the super fun part. I'm gonna show 2 of them. One was, here's Seoul's ambulance fleet stands still. And someone asked, well, what's that about? I said, well, if you go to full electric batteries, if it gets too cold, then the batteries don't work. So, okay, and this is why in Seoul there's a cold snap that lasted 2 weeks and the batteries all popped out. And the last one, this Lima runs out of water. I was talking to a friend from who's in the water business in South America, said that's not going to be 2048, that's going to be 2028. And so even some of these scenarios, it's a way also to create conversation. We also felt that the Sustainable Development Goals was key to this. And we use those as one of our primary markers to understand what this world could look like. So what had happened with each one of these goals? Because as a company, Arup had determined to align its business with these goals. So we need to understand what the implications were on each one of these. And these are all in the report, which you can get. The next one was Extinction Express. So we're doing this clockwise. And Extinction Express is a very uncomfortable world where everything's in double negative. And we can see again, we have domed cities where people have sort of moved into the haves, have created enclaves, and the have-nots are left to either serve those who have or try to just struggle to survive. We have a very highly destabilized natural systems, and resources are resource shortages are pervasive. We call these controlled hells, where large refugee cities have been created because of the extreme lack of water. It's no longer a refugee camp, they're actually refugee cities. And we have isolationism has become the new norm. So if you will, it's a world of thugs and a world of really deep suspicion and hard borders. And the food is quite interesting, that it's all industrialized and controlled by monopolies. So that world, we have a much higher population, a very high wealth gap. We have increase of temperature by 2.5 degrees C. If we're lucky, low cooperation and very low penetration of clean energy. There, our timeline looks something like this, where we've got some very interesting things here, where smog domes for the wealthy are introduced in 2 years' time. We know in Beijing, we already have quite a few smog domes being put over schools. That becomes a much bigger introduction across other cities. And I see there in 2039, a ban on foreign students. Interesting how that has ratcheted forward by 19 years. Very unfortunate. And then the other one to point out on this one is the Zika outbreak in Toronto, because Zika requires a certain climate. And under some of the climate scenarios, Toronto will then become a place where Zika could easily thrive, which is very scary. And also, again, with the indicators, you can see by being at the bottom where they've decreased the SDGs, the only thing that's really gone, it's all bad, that's all. So then we start getting up to the good side. So we have greentocracy. Now, greentocracy becomes quite interesting because when I did some workshops with some young people and some older folks in Arup before I left, we had about 40 individuals, and we asked them, what do you think of these scenarios? And I'm only done with half of them right now. And they said, well, we think these are pretty real. And I said, well, which ones do you think we're going to see next? And all of the older folks said, well, we're going to see Extinction Express. And the younger folks all said, we're going to see greentocracy. Because only through greentocracy will we get to where we want to be. Where the older folks all were like, well, we're never going to agree to this, so why? You know, that was really quite fascinating. I'm being kind of in German grob with that description, but that really was what happened. And here you can see through the image, there's a lot of sort of green, quite literally green everywhere. This is the greening of the cities, the densification, where happy planet, happy people becomes the mantra for every government, where the planet comes first. And we, as I mentioned before, have to live in servitude to the planet, where the environmental degradation of the first quarter of the century really resulted in an outcry, and people went into the streets like they have in the past few weeks for other issues, to demand action. And there was a lot of restoration. The cities became dense. We no longer bulldoze over arable land. And what's very interesting, a lot of that land, which was used for farming, was now rewilded. This is part of the thing. So that we would use a lot more synthetic food, which was kind of interesting. And that was a huge debate, must say, as we talked about how to look at this. So there, the population is still up around 9.5 billion, so still a high wealth gap. But the good thing is there, the increase in temperature has decreased to 1.5 degrees. And, we've got more cooperation because of the agreements with the Sustainable Development Goals and the science-based targets, and a lot of clean energy in order to allow the air to catch back up to itself. Here, the timeline looked a bit different, and I'm just to call out a couple things here. In 2032, the first eco re-education, which is kind of interesting, thinking that, what did we mean by that? It's like, okay, well, if there begin to be state-sponsored eco courses, that you have to go back and be re-educated how to live your life, which is why we were saying this is where you're beginning to lose our freedoms, the freedoms we have perceived. And so that, again, in service of the planet. And then in 42, the expansion of marine protected areas, the MPAs. And the great thing is, with all of this, the greenhouse gas targets have been achieved. So by 2050, we've actually been able to bend that curve, in this case, for our greenhouse gases. The indicators look a little bit better. Not everywhere is really great. Some of the things which we've believed would probably still be quite bad was gender equity. And you see no poverty, there'd be more poverty actually, and how we define poverty in our terms, and some of the infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure, not so sustainable, but but the planet's doing really well. So this is kind of interesting. And then the last one, this is post-Anthropocene. And what's fascinating to me was when we were creating this, how to create something which didn't look like Disney World. That you could actually look at and say, okay, I could imagine that. I could imagine that actually happening. And this was actually the hardest one for me in my head to grasp. It was really interesting. And yet some of the concepts around it, I could totally understand, where we have a lot more freedom to move around the world, where consumers are now consuming at a 1.0 planet instead of the 3-point planets or 16 or 30 planets that we are now, depending on where you are. That our societies are now balanced again, and that the wealth gap between the highest paid and the lowest paid is no longer in the hundreds, but it's then reduced perhaps to 20s. And circular economy is then real. Carbon accounting is included in everything that we do, as is water. And sustainable consumption is linked tightly to the environment. And there's a real private-public partnership to support these Planet First initiatives. And as we're looking at this, and we're all kind of going, this is great, this is where we want to go. And after about 6 months, we could finally start to believe this is potentially possible. The 1.3 degree increase, high cooperation, getting our weather stable again. We created the timeline. And then what was interesting to me is I didn't believe that we would ever see this unless there was some kind of catastrophe. Unless there is some kind of large-scale climate change consequence, as you see there in 2021, which would make the planet pause. I never imagined that we would have a pandemic which would also give us a moment to pause. Or in 2028, the Great Climate March, as we've seen just recently with the Black Lives Matter and the rights of all, the marches which we have seen. So this was really, for me, when this happened in the past 3 months, it gave me for the first time in almost 2 years, hope that we could really maybe get to this post-Anthropocene within my lifetime. The last little red circle here, I'd say, is a plastic patch museum. I just love that little idea that in 2047, we have a museum to that awful floating morass of plastic, the two of them, one in the Pacific and one in the Atlantic. And that would just be amazing. So of course, the indicators are all up on the upper quadrants where everything's improved. Not everything's perfect, but it's really, poverty's at an all-time low. GMOs helping reduce our hunger, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really, that was the world we were trying to get to. Now, I'm kind of blitzing through this because this is all, entire thing is available online to download as a free PDF for anybody. We did this not for us, but for anybody. So there's also a big comparison there. You can see, I sometimes think we could have pushed it harder with some of the population. But population growth and decline is a very difficult topic. To talk about the need for reducing population to 1 child per couple is something you just can't do in polite company. So we kept them all up at high numbers. The wealth gap's a lot easier. The temperature increases as well. The other ones you can already read. Within those, we also had, I hired a writer, a science fiction writer, to try to create some stories about individuals and what a day in their life looked like. Because it's one thing to read a bunch of numbers and to imagine these stories, but it's another thing to try to put yourself or somebody, a human being, into that world and trying to think into that life. And so these are just some quotes out of the 4 individuals who were written up. And I think that what's kind of fascinating to me is when you read those quotes, as I'm sure everyone is doing, all of a sudden in your own mind, you can create an image of a street, of a place, of some news that you might have seen or someone you've talked to who might have said something close to that. And it makes it just that more plausible that world could come to pass. And that's where I meant the difference between, or there's these 2 parts of data and emotion, where we're trying to, to really with these, you touch on both. So the question we always ask is, which world would you rather live in? And which world do you think we're going to move into next? Now, there is no such thing as singularity on our planet, and I guarantee you, in your beautiful country or in Switzerland, I could go and probably find each one of these 4 worlds in a little microcosm, right? But the question is, for the majority, which one do we want to go to? Where do we want to go? What's the story we want to write? And to me, the other part is to help make sure that we're empowering individuals to believe and to have the tools to also help write that story, right? Because at the end of the day, the future is fiction. It is a story which all of us write. And we write it together, as in this, for me, an amazing picture which my team found is, which path do we choose? The railway, the straight road, the curvy road, the little walking paths in between. We get to choose those paths. And I think, and this is very important to me. So we did those scenarios, and I have more behind it. I could show you some more, but I thought I'd stop here and see if you wanted to ask some questions or some comments. Just stop there.